What if I told you that one of America's greatest evangelists was a drunk Armenian who immigrated to the States in the late 1800s? His name is Nishan Der Garabedian, but he was known to the world as Joe the Turk. Lieutenant Colonel Eddie Hobgood joins this conversation to discuss his research for his upcoming book on Joe the Turk. Joe not only expanded the ministries of the Salvation Army across America, he also was an innovator. He introduced new instruments like the saxophone to the States. He also was the first person to dress up as Santa Claus to raise funds for the homeless. He did this and so much more, all while leading thousands of people to a transformative faith in Jesus Christ. Hello, my friends. My name is Pastor Haig, and welcome to the Christ and Coffee podcast, uniting Christians one conversation at a time. So please grab a cup of coffee and enjoy this Christ-centered podcast. Hello, Eddie. Welcome to the Christ and Coffee podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
How are you doing? What part of the world are you joining us from?
I live in Florida. I live in North Tampa Bay. Okay. So I woke up this morning to temperatures about 55, 56. So for Floridians, that's winter.
Wow. That's great. Are you born and raised in that part of the world, or?
I grew up in North Carolina. That's my home, and lived there until I left to enter the Salvation Army College for Officers in Atlanta, Georgia, back in the early 80s.
So what does that mean exactly? What's the Salvation Army, and then how do they recruit their officials?
Sure. Yeah. Well, the Salvation Army is actually a branch of the Christian church. It was founded in 1865 by a husband and wife team named William and Catherine Booth. They were out of the Methodist church, and he felt this real calling to minister to the poor. And so they left the Methodist church, moved to London, and he ministered in the East End where all the poor and downtrodden were. And she was actually quite a novelty, as she was a woman preacher. And back in Victorian days, that was a very rare thing. Oh, wow. And she captured the hearts and the attention of the people in the West End. But eventually she left the West End and they moved into the East End and started the Salvation Army.
Great. And then they had a branch in America. What's the story there?
Yep. Interestingly, a 16-year-old girl from the United Kingdom, she and her family were coming to the United States to live. And she wrote William Booth and said, "I'd like to start the Salvation Army." And he said, "Okay." And she said, "I'd like your blessing." He said, "Well, go see what you can do, and then we'll see if we can bless you or not." So she came over with her family, and they actually started the Salvation Army in Philadelphia in an abandoned chair factory. And word got back to William Booth, and he sent an official delegation of one male officer and 7 female officers called the Hallelujah Lassies. And They landed in the Battery Park in New York and started in earnest, starting the Salvation Army there. So about 1880 is when it all happened.
Amazing.
So we've been in the States since then.
So one of the most Googled questions when it comes to religion is, what is the Salvation Army? It's quite fascinating. People see the symbol everywhere, the logo everywhere, but it's one of those things where it's like, what is that?
Yeah, and a lot of people don't understand that the Salvation Army is a church. It is a religious movement and a part of the body of Christ, a recognized denomination. What most people in the States recognize the Salvation Army for is thrift stores, bells at Christmas, and that kind of thing. But there's so much more. That's just the tip of the iceberg. It is a fully functioning church. And back in the day when this all started, it came with this military terminology, because during Victorian England, military terms and military clothing also was really popular. So William Booth was called General Superintendent. But in 1878, when it became officially known as the Salvation Army, they lost the general and the superintendent, and he just became the general. And pastors became officers, and members of the congregation became soldiers. So that's the terminology. So when you see a Salvation Army officer with red epaulets on his shirt or his tunic, those are ordained ministers in the Salvation Army Church. And the uniforms that have blue trim on, those are soldiers, the members of the church. And we are mostly known for our social work, but we are part of the Evangelical Christian Church, and we are a member of the holiness movement. That's one of the two tenets that the Salvation Army is built on: salvation and holiness.
Great. And it has nothing to do with anything militaristic or violence related, I assume. I don't have to just ask the question.
No. We say our weapon is love. Our weapons are love. So no guns, no violence like that. The devil is our enemy, and we fight against him in sin.
Amazing. So you felt this calling to join this church movement, and then you went to Atlanta, Georgia headquarters. What is that like? Is it like a seminary?
It is. It is a seminary. There are actually 4 of them in the United States. The United States is divided up into 4 sections we call territories. So you have the South, that's the 15 southern states and District of Columbia. Then you have the East, which is basically the Northeast. And then Middle America is called the Central Territory. And then you have the West Coast and a couple of other states attached to it called the Western Territory. And the headquarters for the Western Territory is Ranchos Palos Verdes, it used to be a Catholic seminary, but the Salvation Army bought it about 50 years ago and turned it into the Salvation Army Seminary. It's also where the corporate headquarters for the Salvation Army is for the western part of the country. Atlanta is the headquarters for the South, and that's where its seminary is. There's a seminary in West Nyack, New York, and then there's a seminary in Chicago.
Yeah, it's amazing, because I'm originally from the Rockland County area, and the fact that there's this headquarters right by my neck of the woods was just mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And that's where I got to learn more about Joe the Turk, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But so you get this calling to become a trained, ordained minister. You're a lieutenant colonel. What does that mean exactly? Or is that like a high-ranking clergyman, or?
Yeah. Once you're finished training the seminary, you're commissioned as a lieutenant, and you'll stay a lieutenant for 5 years. And then at your 5th anniversary, you're promoted to captain, and you'll stay a captain for 10 years. And at your 15th year, you're a major, and then you will stay a major. Anything above that, lieutenant colonel, or commissioner, are high-ranking positions that are given by the international headquarters of the Salvation Army, which is in London still.
So they honor the ranking based on the longevity of your tenures?
Well, the first 15 years, yeah. But after that, it's really based, I don't know how to say it, I guess performance, merit. The Army doesn't pay you very well, so they use the ranking system to recognize you.
Got it. Yeah, I could relate. Any clergy listening could relate to what you just said.
Absolutely.
Amazing stuff. So then you are about to release this book on Joe the Turk.
Yes.
This is kind of the main reason why we're having this interview. So for those who don't know, I found out about this guy about 10 years ago, and I had no idea. First of all, he's not Turkish, he's Armenian. And right. The influence he's had in American history, and specifically through the Salvation Army of America, is quite remarkable, but barely has anyone's heard of him.
Right. Yeah, that's the sad thing. and I was just shocked that nobody had written a book about him, all these years.
So who is Joe the Turk?
Okay, yeah. Well, his real name, he was born in Talis in Turkey. His real name is Nishan Der Garabedian. And when he was a teenager, 14, his father actually had been a priest in the Apostolic Armenian Church and died when he.
The dare is usually a reference to that if you're in front of the Armenian name. And Nishan is a very common Armenian name, which means sign, miracle. Yeah. Right.
And Garabedian or Garabed, I understand, means good news bearer. So, which I think all of that just kind of plays into really what it was a foretelling of what his life is going to be like.
Your name has that effect, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and when his parents died, his mother died when he was 14. He left Talis and went to Constantinople, where he had a brother who was a wealthy businessman, and he moved in with him and took up a trade of the shoemaker's trade. Then 1877 happened, the Russo-Turkish War, and he fled Constantinople and went to Tbilisi, which is in the modern day country of Georgia today. And there was an Armenian refugee settlement there. And while he was there for a couple of years. Another brother immigrated to America and started writing him and telling him how wonderful life was in the United States. So he went back to Constantinople for a little while. Unfortunately, he had picked up a really bad habit and was really a heavy drinker. And so his brother, his rich brother, got frustrated with him and put him on a ship and sent him to the United States. On the way, his ship stopped in Liverpool, and he was going to make his connection, but they were late docking, and he missed his connection. He had to stay 8 days in Liverpool. But while he was there, he and a traveling companion who happened to be an Armenian priest, they saw the Salvation Army marching down the street, doing their little parade and what they call an open air service on the street corner. But what caught his attention was how cruelly the Salvationists were being treated. I mean, the people were throwing rocks and trash, anything that could be a missile, throwing it at them. And he got really upset. And so about the second or third day, he started trailing behind the parade with a big stick. And he was a big fella. He was 6 feet tall, 250 pounds. And so he kind of beat they called them the skeleton army, because they were against the Salvation Army. And they were against the Salvation Army for a couple of reasons. One is people were getting saved, and they weren't drinking anymore, and they were becoming responsible citizens and taking care of their families. And the saloon keepers didn't like that because they were losing business left and right. And then the respectable church didn't like the Salvation Army because they thought it was very crude what they were doing on the street corners, that they weren't dignified in the chapels. So there were a lot of folks that were mistreating the army, and he saw that, and he kind of came to their rescue. But after 8 days, he left and went to America, met his brother up in Worcester, Massachusetts, lived with him for about a year. And then he had this wandering spirit about him, and he landed in San Francisco, California.
Amazing. So these like when the Salvation Army is like marching through the streets, is it like a prayer walk sort of thing? Are they using instrumentations and just like declaring Jesus Christ? It's part of the evangelistic.
Yep. They'll have they'll have the bands marching with them. The ladies will be playing timbrels. They'll have the Salvation Army flag, and they march down the street to a street corner, and then they actually hold a religious service there, sharing the gospel, sharing the testimonies, singing, and at the end they invite people to come and kneel at the drum, which was a makeshift altar, and receive Christ into their hearts. And the Army was really involved in this, probably up until about the 1970s. And it's kind of petered out right now. But it was very much part of every Salvation Army community that they would do these. And interestingly, when in San Francisco, when Joe finally hooked up with the Salvation Army, they were doing open airs 3 and 4 times a day. So they were out and about every day, every night, and especially on Saturdays and Sundays, several times a day, having these street services and asking people to accept Christ into their hearts.
So Joe Nishan Garabedian here, Der Garabedian, he's still not a Christian at this point. He just like kind of related to them because they seem like, why are you treating these people poorly? He probably has this history of being a second-class citizen. So he kind of senses that. So but he's struggling with alcoholism. He's kind of this wandering spirit. He ends up in San Francisco. Then what happens to him?
Well, when he gets to San Francisco, a couple of things happen. When he comes to the United States, he changes his name to John Garabed.
Okay.
And so when he hits San Francisco, that's his name. Well, he's because he's drinking still. One of the jobs that he was working at, he had an Irish buddy who became his drinking partner, and they're having a conversation one day at the bar, and the guy says to him, "So tell me what your name is exactly." So he tells him it's John Garabed, and he said, "No, you don't look like a John to me. You look like a Joe, and since you were born in Turkey, I'm going to call you Joe the Turk." And that's how he got his name. And believe it or not, he embraced it. And actually, as you look ahead, I don't think he had any clue or idea how having that name opened up so many doors for him for ministry over the next few years.
Yeah, because I mean, it's still a struggle for me with my name Haig, but it's now socially acceptable to be an ethnic name. But back then, there was no way Nishan was going to fly.
Right.
And then there's this disconnect of a Joe with someone from the Ottoman Empire. Like I can't imagine just what's going through the brains there. And I do know like the Armenian communities that ended up in Worcester and Fresno, they were viewed as second-class citizens for a while, and then we kind of like said like, oh, we're Caucasian, let us have our rights. Like, and there's always
right.
those interesting the diversity of the 1800s is just different mindset. I mean, the Irish, the Italian, it's just a whole other world. So he has this drinking buddy. The drinking buddy says, "Hey, let's call you Joe the Turk." So he's still drinking. What is he doing for work? How is he making a living?
There was a steel factory there that he was working at, and he did that actually for quite a while. And while he was working there, he actually met a guy who was a soldier of the Salvation Army. And this guy, his name's John Millsaps, was very evangelical, very evangelistic. And every day he pressed Joe to get saved, to quit drinking, to quit smoking, and give his life to Jesus. He even would bring him an apple every day. And when they had their break, he'd say, eat this apple instead of taking a cigarette break. And so they ended up actually living in the same boarding house. And so he actually got to see John Millsap's life, the example of his life. And he said, I'm just going to watch and see if he really is who he says he is. So at work, when the boss is around, everybody's on their best behavior. But when the boss leaves, the cat's away, the mice will play. But he watched John Millsaps and saw that he worked just as hard and was just as faithful when the boss wasn't there as when he was. And at the boarding home, every night when they would gather around the table to eat, he would be the one who would bow his head and he would pray. He'd show up early at work with a songbook and a Bible and do a Bible study with the men who wanted to have that. So this really impacted him. And so one evening, the Salvation Army was marching past his, eventually he left that and opened up a shoe shop because that was what he knew. So he opened up a shoe shop. And one evening, the Salvation Army was marching by and he heard them and he remembered them from England and had this warm feeling toward them. So he steps out and he follows over to the open air meeting that they're having. And he sees several of the people being abused. In particular, this one young lady, the Salvation Lassie, she was kneeling and she was praying this really fervent prayer for San Francisco that people would find Jesus. And this young hoodlum picks up a big handful of mud and throws it at her and hits her in the face. And she paused just to wipe the mud off of her face. And then she continued praying. Well, he was so ticked about what had happened to this young, innocent girl that he goes over and finds a piece of lead pipe, picks it up, walks over to where this group of troublemakers are and starts swinging and takes 6 of them out.
Wow.
And so after that, he does what he did in England. He starts following behind the Salvation Army parade and dares anybody to mess with him. And so one night, he sees another Salvationist get just with the drunk comes out of the saloon with a whiskey bottle and just smashes it into the drummer's face. And it's just bloodied and cut all up. And the drummer falls down on top of his drum. And after a few seconds, he reaches around for his drumstick and he starts resuming beating the drum, telling everybody, keep on going, keep singing, keep praying, keep preaching. And that just really just ripped Joe's heart. And he fell on his knees and asked Jesus to come into his life that night on that street corner. And in his testimony that he gives about it, he talks about how, he was just so wanting to have this experience that he didn't feel people spitting on him or he didn't feel the rocks that they were throwing at him, that he just knew that he was a new person, a new creation. And he immediately quit drinking. Took a little longer to quit smoking, but eventually he gave both of those up in order to become a Salvation Army soldier.
So you have to be no drinking, no smoking to be enlisted.
That's
Part of the
the
holiness
South.
tradition. Yeah.
Yeah, that's part of the holiness tradition, but also because in the early days, a lot of our converts were alcoholics.
Interesting.
And you know, and we get the Army's gotten a lot of flack over the years because it doesn't do communion. It's not against communion, and whenever we go to any other church that offers it, we're encouraged to participate. But it just doesn't do it because, again, so many people in the early days were alcoholics, and we didn't have Welch's grape juice back then.
Yeah. Of course. It's fascinating.
So yeah.
But it's interesting. So that he's always seemed to be anti-bully from the beginning. Like anytime he sees someone being bullied, the little guy being persecuted, and it makes sense being a Christian Armenian and living in the Ottoman Empire to feel that way when you see that sort of abuse happen, and then I guess he's just upset. He probably was told like this doesn't happen in England, this doesn't happen in America, but then it does happen.
Right.
And there's this reaction for him to step up. And it was interesting, the nonviolent reactions of the Salvation Army, that revolutionary love your enemy, pray for those who persecute you witness is really what brought him to this is legitimate.
Right. Yeah. And in the end, that was one of the things that really turned the American public, their attitude toward the Salvation Army turned around when they saw that these people were sincere and that they were making a difference and they were serving a population in a community that nobody else wanted to touch. You know, they didn't think twice about getting on their hands and knees in the dirt and the mud and, you know, pulling the drunk out of the gutter and, you know, getting them cleaned up and get their lives cleaned up. You know, there are lots of stories of all night prayer meetings where they prayed through and, you know, until it broke through, they didn't stop. And so, yeah, when I think as the American public saw that, it began to change its attitude toward the Army, although persecution lasted for quite a number of years. And, you know, one of the things that happened is Joe, when the Army was denied its right to preach in the street, its constitutional right to assemble and preach, he would be sent into communities and he would march and pray till he got arrested. And he was arrested 52 times.
Wow.
For preaching on the street. And his last arrest happened in 1917. And after that, the Army, or he, wasn't arrested anymore. But there were pockets all over the country where the Army was oppressed like that. And, you know, he felt like the Army was his family when he joined. And his whole attitude was, I'm not going to let happen to this family what's happened to my other family in Turkey.
Yeah, and then 1915 and earlier, we had our genocide, and then the Hamadan massacres before that, and a lot of precursors to that. So yeah, I'm sure over time he got more and more resentful for that Turk label because of all that. Yeah, and he actually a couple things. One is his typical thing as he traveled, and he conducted more than 2,000 evangelistic campaigns around the United States during his life, probably more than any other Salvation Army officer in the United States ever. And he would typically go in for 3 nights. And on the first night, he'd give his testimony. And then on the second night, he'd give the testimony of his sister, Maritza, who was converted through his letters that he wrote her. And she became a Christian in Turkey. And then when the Holocaust happened, she moved over to Greece and became a missionary in the Armenian refugee settlement that was there. And then on the third night, he would do 2 things. First of all, he was an amazing musician. He could play by ear. And so he played the cornet. He had a special cornet that he created. And when you flip the valve, it gave out 4 times more volume than it would a regular cornet or trumpet would give. He played the saxophone. He introduced the saxophone to a great part of the United States. Back in that day, the saxophone was not an instrument in the United States. Yeah, I think we have to pause right here and understand all these brass instruments are new technologies in many ways. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so that, and then this invention, the zonophone, which we know as a gramophone, which we know as a record player, that was invented. And he bought records of symphonic recordings, Christian music, and he would play it on the zonophone, and he would play along with it on his saxophone or his cornet. I say he was like the original karaoke guy.
but instrumentally. And he would do these concerts on the third night in all the cities, and the Army would sell tickets to it, and the place would be packed out. I mean, they would have to rent the biggest hall in the town to hold the people that came. I mean, there are counts of thousands. I have one account of where 30,000 people gathered at an open air meeting to hear him speak. But at this concert that he would give, in between songs, he would talk about the Armenians and the Armenian crisis in the 1890s. After 1895, when the Hamidian massacres happened, he talked specifically about that. He even went over to Turkey, got arrested because he was a citizen of Turkey, according to the leadership. So they arrested him, and he escaped. But he came back with a sword, the double-edged sword, and he would show that off. And he had pictures of some of the massacres that had happened. I mean, he was not apologetic at all about telling what was happening to the Armenian people. And of course, you may or may not know this, but in 1895-96, the Salvation Army got very involved in bringing refugees over to this country. There's several instances where they got to Ellis Island and they were not allowed into the country because they didn't have family, they didn't have jobs, and they didn't have any money. Most of them, they barely escaped Turkey with the clothes on their back. So the Salvation Army went to bat with the federal government and said, you've got to let these people come. And the Army had a farm up in New Jersey, Ramsey, New Jersey, that they converted into to housing. And so, they could hold up to 150 men. And so they would bring them in, get them acclimated, and then work with the Salvation Army network all across the United States to get these people rehomed and rehoused and jobs. So that, they wouldn't have to go back to Turkey. And of course, they all said, we'll die before we go back to Turkey because we're going to die if we go back. But the Army had a huge rally at Carnegie Hall, and some of the who's, in the New York area came to that and supported it. And so several hundred Armenians were able to get into the country because of the Army's effort. And Joe obviously was there and served as a translator for his kinsmen. So that was what would happen on the third night. He would play, but he would also tell the story of his people. And I've got dozens and dozens of newspaper articles where they say, this is what he said, this is what he shared. And so he was very passionate about that.
That's amazing to hear, because I just hear he just went around and evangelized a bunch of people, but this is open air rallies with music, with testimony, with relief effort, and it kind of captures the spirit of the Salvation Army's ministry. Let's go to the streets, let's help the poor, let's help the least of these, but let's also be unashamed of our faith and share it boldly and proudly. Let us celebrate with the arts too. I think we take that for granted when churches are more innovative with their musical expression. And we have to think that this is kind of like, we have the contemporary music versus the hymns debate, but this is kind of, I'm sure they had similar debates. How dare you worship with a saxophone?
Yeah. Well, the early Army, I think, was way more open to this kind of thing. And they were very into theatrics. I mean, there's one story of a Salvation Army officer. They were having to march down the street and they're carrying a coffin on their shoulders, and they carried into the Salvation Army church building and lay it down. And all this crowd has followed them in to see, what was going on. And all of a sudden the lid of the coffin opens up and the officer jumps out and gives this sermon about, how I've come from death to life. His testimony about what happens to us when we accept Christ into our life. So theatrics were a big part of the Salvation Army. And the other thing that was interesting too is that the Army was very big about taking popular songs, barroom songs, and giving them religious words and using them. And Joe was very, very good about doing that very thing.
Yeah, it's amazing. I think a lot of Armenians per capita are very musically inclined. I think like the country of Armenia has like the most pianos per square footage or something. Like there's some like ridiculous statistic about music, chess, and our Christianity seem to be like the game chess, and our Christian faith is definitely there in our culture, deeply rooted, going back to 301. It's interesting that he's just personifying all his heritage in this new venue. You mentioned the Salvation Army was big on theatrics. What did Joe the Turk wear? What did Nishan wear?
Well, if you look over here,
Is that
that's actually that's a
photograph?
reproduction. No,
Or a
that's a
picture?
real. That's a real. No, it's a real uniform. Let me.
Yeah, that's an actual uniform of his.
Well, it's a reproduction. The
Reproduction,
the
got it.
the real one of this is got way more gold on it, and it's on exhibit at the Salvation Army Historic Museum in West Nyack, New York. Your friend Rob.
Yeah,
Yeah, so you probably saw that. You probably saw his hat and his umbrella that he was very famous for. So yeah.
Yeah, for all those in the North Jersey, New York area who watch this podcast, visit the museum in West Nyack. It was across the street from my old dentist. That's how I found out about it.
Wow, yeah, but yeah, they've got some of his original things. Is one of his original cornets, and if you look at it, you can see it's got this special tubing in it that when he flipped the switch, the volume increased. So yeah, they got some great things there.
Amazing stuff. And so, what is his legacy? Like, what was his impact? Because I don't think I'm able to process how many people he's affected. Is there what's the data on that?
Well, when he died, obviously, and this is really interesting because he was probably the most famous Salvation Army officer in his day. I have newspaper articles that I've collected where it simply says Joe the Turk said blah blah blah. And that's it. There was no explanation saying, the Salvation Army's, they didn't have to say that because people knew who he was, because his escapades, his arrest made the papers, a lot of newspapers. It was front page news, especially some of the ones that were long and drawn out and protracted. The people would read it. And the Salvation Army, its national publication is called The War Cry. And one of the reasons we know so much about Joe is that he practically every week would write a travel log of where he'd been, what he'd experienced. And then people in the local communities, they would write in and say, Joe was here and this is what happened. And, we had 3,000 people in the street and everybody wants him to come back. He was so wonderful, blah, 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 that sort of stuff. And the newspapers in the beginning, some of the newspapers didn't like him, but it wasn't long before he won them over. And there's some just wonderful stories that the newspapers have given us. Interestingly, I took out a 1-year subscription to newspapers.com and spent the entire year every night trying to find newspaper articles. I reckon I've probably got about a third or a quarter of what's out there. I just ran out of time and I couldn't, but I've got a couple of thick notebooks full of articles about him. And he was the darling of the press when he came to town most of the time. So
there's some stories that are myth, there's some stories that are legend, and then some stories that are so out there, but they actually happened. So what are some of the stories that really stand out? Because there's so much to cover here from his collective missionary adventures, I would say.
Yeah. Let's see. Well, we're talking about arrests. One interesting one is when he was in Colorado Springs, Colorado, he got arrested 5 times. So what would happen is he would get arrested.
What would be the charge? He's just disturbing the peace, or he's like
disturbing the peace,
state? Or?
No, nothing. No, it was typically a lot of times there was an ordinance that said, like, for example, there's a great story from Malden, Massachusetts, where he beat the drum. And there was an ordinance that says you cannot beat a drum. They didn't have a problem with them marching, but no drums. And so, the bass drum is a big part of the Army. And so they when the Army was denied the right to do that, they called Joe, and he came into town, and they made a big announcement at 8:00 tonight. The Army's going to be out on the street again, and we have a special guest. His name is Joe the Turk, and at 8:00 on the dot, he's going to beat the drum. Well, this particular newspaper article, the guy who wrote it several years later said he had been a kid at the time, and all the kids were allowed to stay up past 8:00 that night because the whole town came out to see what was going to happen between the police and the Salvation Army. And sure enough, he beat the drum and he was arrested. And several days later, he was released, and the Army was okay to do that. That happened over and over again. But in Colorado Springs, he got arrested, and he'd go back out and do the same thing again, and he got arrested again. and he got released, and he'd go back out 5 times. He did that. And finally they're like, okay, we're done with you. It's over. So that a couple interesting things. He was in Macomb, Illinois, and the Salvation Army officers had been arrested and put in jail because the mayor and the chief of police were corrupt. They actually were outlaws that had come from Texas and taken over Macomb. And so Joe came on the scene and did this big rally and got everybody on his side. And at that particular time, they're having a big Republican rally in Macomb, and he hooked up with them, and they all had this gigantic parade. And the mayor and the outlaws, in the middle of the night, they fled town because they knew that, they weren't going to be able to control the town anymore, that Joe had got all these people on his side. The officers were released, and they asked Joe if he would be their temporary mayor until they were able to hold elections. And he said, yeah, I'll do that. But one condition is the Salvation Army captain, he needs to be the chief of police until you get the chief of police. So for 5 weeks, Joe was the mayor of Macomb, Illinois.
That's hysterical. So he kind of cleaned house with the corruption there. He got rid of a little revolution in the local Macomb, Illinois.
Yeah.
Fascinating stuff. Yeah. And he would just like lead people to faith during these moments. His main goal was evangelism, right? Or was it relief work?
Absolutely. No, it was actually evangelism. Because what would happen, especially in these travel logs, he would talk about, I'm on the train, and I get on the train, I pull out my cornet or my saxophone, and I start playing, and I drew a crowd, and then I was able to tell them, about Jesus, and obviously, back in that day, there probably were people were a little more sensitive to that, and they were respectful of it. But he was not ashamed to buttonhole somebody and say, how is it with your soul? So when he died, the program that was written, the write-up about him said, he led thousands of people during his life to Christ, and that was a big part of what he did. He was not embarrassed or ashamed or shy about sharing the gospel and asking people, how is it with your soul?
Amazing stuff. What made you interested to write about him and find out about him?
Well, interestingly, I came to the Salvation Army when I was 9 years old. They actually had one of these open air meetings in my neighborhood, and I had been going to a Baptist church, and I just wasn't really happy there. I didn't fit in. And so one Sunday afternoon, back in the day, Sunday afternoons were very quiet and peaceful, restful. I heard this noise. And I think, what happened? Has the circus come to town or something? So I run out of the house down to the other end of the block, and there's this Salvation Army open air meeting. And so I'm like, golly, who are these people? I want to know them. And so I got invited to their Tuesday afternoon youth programming. And after a couple of weeks of that, I got invited to Sunday school, and so started going to Sunday school. And then a few weeks after that, they put a brass instrument in my hand and started teaching me how to play a brass instrument and a keyboard. And so I was hooked. The Salvation Army, for junior members of the church, they're called junior soldiers. And so while the adults were having big church, the kids were taken out to junior church. And there was a particular curriculum that we were doing, and it was about heroes of the faith of the Salvation Army, because there was always a biblical lesson, and they always threw some Salvation Army history in there. And that particular year, they were doing these trading card type things, baseball card type things with different people's faces. One was William Booth, Catherine Booth, and Joe the Turk. And actually, up there in that one picture frame, the black one, I actually have the card from the series.
Amazing.
And so that's how I first heard about him. But then several years later, when I was in my assignment with the Army was youth work. So I was the youth director for the Salvation Army for the state of Florida. And the Salvation Army held this big conference in Washington, D.C. of 2,000 or 3,000 people. Board members and advisory people and officers were coming. And so they decided they wanted to do this living walk through history museum. So you'd walk through it and you stand there, and about 30, 45 seconds, they would reenact some famous bit of Salvation Army history. Well, it took about 12 to 15 minutes to go through that. So they reached out to me and they said, we want you to write a 15-minute monologue about Joe the Turk. And we want you to be Joe the Turk and stand out in front of this museum and do that every 15 minutes every time while we're going through, so the next crowd can be entertained before they come inside. So over the course of that weekend, I presented that monologue more than 50 times. And so a lot of people saw it. And so people started asking me to come and do this little monologue for them. And then over the course of time, it evolved and it developed into actually almost a 1 hour presentation that I do. And I am very conscious of the fact, I wasn't then, but I'm very conscious of the fact that I am not Armenian, that I'm not 6 feet tall and 250 pounds. I have this real love for theater. My idea of heaven is a Broadway show all day long, every day for eternity. It just kind of fell into my lap, but I really have fallen in love with this guy and his story. It has, it's revolutionized my life, and it's a great example for us of faithfulness, especially in time of persecution. And we don't know anything like that in the States for being persecuted for our religious faith like he experienced. And it's my constant prayer, Lord, if that happens to me, please make me faithful, that I won't turn tail and run away. So that happened, and I've had the chance to present the longer version for quite a while in a lot of places. But again, as I said earlier, I've been shocked that nobody's ever written a book about him. There's an article here and an article there. But there's no full understanding, of the complete story, or more understanding of the story. So I started collecting articles maybe, 15, 20 years ago. And so it's built up to these, all those notebooks that
amazing
right there, all those. Yeah. Those are my Joe the Turk notebooks, and they're filled with newspaper articles, war cry articles. I've got correspondence. When he died, he left everything he had to the Salvation Army, so they came into his apartment and took all of his personal papers and things like that. So we've been able to go through those and learn some things about him that we didn't know. And the other thing, I think I mentioned this to you the other day when we were talking about when he died. He's buried at Kensico there in New York. And when he died penniless. When he retired from the Salvation Army, he got a pension. And you got to remember, this is 1937. His pension was $24 a month. And he wanted to live in New York City. And he actually did. He lived on 3rd Avenue, 3rd Street. It's not far from where. Go ahead. Sorry.
Because I was a pastor of the Armenian Evangelical Church in New York for 10 years on 34th and Lexington. Is there any correspondence with the church that's 127 years there? Or from your...
I honestly, I don't know the answer to that. I just know that the main Salvation Army church and headquarters was about 6 blocks away from him. So that could have something, I don't know. And actually the apartment building is still standing today that he lived in and he died in. But he tried to buy.
There was a little Armenia in that area, like the Murray Hill. There's 3 churches there. It's just fascinating that. Well, I mean, that's where I lived for the past 10 years.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. That could very well have something to do with it because again, he was very proud of his Armenian heritage. And I will say that the Salvation Army was very respectful of that, because in a lot of these articles and even newspapers, they'll say Joe the Turk, but he's not a Turk. He's actually an Armenian. And so they were, and on the war cry articles, they would always end Joseph Garabed and in parentheses, Joe the Turk.
Got it.
So they were very...
So sorry to cut you off with your story. So he was struggling at the end of his life. He never married or anything like that.
He did not. He was a wanderer. He didn't have time.
He was all in.
All in. Yeah. So no, he didn't marry, but he tried to buy this apartment building, and he was just a terrible landlord. I mean, I have records of where somebody went a whole year without paying. And the thing is, he needed to collect every single rent in order to make the mortgage payment. And it didn't leave him a penny to do any kind of improvements or things like that. And of course, the health department came in and said, well, you got to do this and this and this. And so at the end of the day, he lost the apartment complex, but they let him stay in his apartment, and he became the manager of the complex, and he collected the rents on behalf of the company that ended up buying it. But I have a letter that he wrote to his niece in Marseille, France. He had family there. And he says to her, I'm not doing well. I got beaten up, and all my money was stolen that I had collected to pay to the rent company. I'm afraid they're going to put me in jail. I've been in the hospital 2 or 3 times. I'm still not well. And so a year or so later, about a year later, he died. And when he died, he had no money. So when he was buried in Kensico, and in those days, you have to remember the Salvation Army was very poor. It'd be a different story today. But because he had no money and the Army had no money, he was buried in an unmarked grave. He was buried in the Salvation Army plot where all the Salvationists were buried, but it was an unmarked grave. And so back in the early 1980s, a gentleman named Daniel Bazikian from Paramus, I know him. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So he had heard about Joe the Turk, and so they contacted the Salvation Army in New York and said, "Where can we find him?" So they told him where he was at. So they went to the cemetery, and they couldn't find the grave. So they found one of the groundskeepers said, "Can you help us find him? Because he's important to us, to our people." And so the groundskeeper did. They found it. So then Daniel contacted the Salvation Army and said, "What's the deal here?" And the Army said, well, he didn't have any money. We didn't have any money. And so Daniel said, well, we're going to do something about that. So he started the Garabed Foundation, I think is what he called it. And he raised $1,000. And with that $1,000, he bought this beautiful headstone that's at Joe the Turk's grave now. And then there was this big ceremony with the Armenian community, the Armenian priests, and the Salvation Army with their big band and all that. They had a real dedication. So that kind of brought the story full circle.
Amazing. Wow. Fascinating stuff. So is the book finished, or it's about to be finished? You're writing?
The first draft is finished. It's in the revision stage right now. And I'm just waiting to hear back from the publisher as to when in 24 they have it in the schedule to publish. So my goal is to get these edits done and do one more edit and have a couple more people look at it. But it should be ready by the end of the year to go to publication.
Amazing stuff. Just one last question. I don't know if this is true or not. Was Joe the Turk influential about Santa Claus and collecting charity around Christmas time? Is that true, or is that not true?
That's an absolutely true story. What happened?
Oh, wow. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. What happened was, Macy's, which has been there a long time, they had an inside Santa Claus. But now when you walk down New York City streets, you'll see Santa Clauses now, and they're different charities and sometimes Volunteers of America, which sprung out of the Salvation Army. But Joe, they used to raise money for the Christmas Day dinner for the poor, and they'd have 2,000 or 3,000 people that they would feed on Christmas Day. So Joe dressed up like Santa Claus, got into a wagon, and this guy was driving him around, and they had 4 Salvation Army ladies with little collecting buckets also, and so they would walk on each side of the wagon, and they would slowly stroll through New York City, and he would play Christmas carols on his saxophone and his cornet, and so they collected this money. This particular instance that's in the War Cry says that they were doing that one day, and they had collected about $500. Now, remember, this is like 1900. That's a lot of money. And so they lingered longer than they should have in one space, and the cop came by and said, "You're all arrested." So he hops on the wagon, scoots the driver over, takes the reins, and they go to the precinct. When they get there, and the chief of the police sees what's happened, he says to the officer, "Are you an idiot? Why did you arrest these people? Don't arrest these people. They're doing good. They're raising money for the poor for Christmas Day dinner." And so he says to Joe, "You guys go back out, raise all the money you can." He said to the officer, "Don't bother them again." So he was the first Santa Claus on the streets of New York City.
That's a miracle. Wow. That's just made my That's just made my day. I could talk to you for hours about this. I'm excited to read your book, and I'm so grateful for your time and your research and dedication and ministry. And I would love to get his story out to as many people as possible. So thank you, Eddie, so much for your time. Thank you for those who are watching the Christ and Coffee podcast. Keep your eyes out for when the book comes out in 2024. Thank you for listening to the end of this program. Have a blessed week, and God bless.